Good morning, one and all present here. Now we are going to start the free paper session. The session will be chaired by Dr. M. Sophia. Welcome to the dais, ma'am.
Dr. M. Sophia. She has completed MBBS from Madurai Medical College and MD Psychiatric Consultant Psychiatrist at Mano Health Center, Pudukkottai. She has 12 years of experience in clinical practice. Immediate past Secretary, Madurai Psychiatric Society. Welcome, ma'am.
Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to today's session, and we are starting this a free paper. As a first presenter, I call upon Dr. Arpita Chakrabarti to present her paper. You'll be given 5 minutes and 2 minutes for questions. Okay. Give a brief introduction of yourself, and then on the dais.
Good morning, everyone. This is Arpita Chakravarti from Department of General Medicine, Kasturba Medical College, Manipal, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. So I'll be discussing about the topic which is related to my PhD. It is a part of work, not related to my entire PhD. So the title I will be dealing on in the upcoming slides is the alterations in serum phospholipids in type 2 diabetes mellitus patients with cognitive dysfunction and untargeted lipidomics approach. So I'll be dealing on this following contents: introduction, methodology, results, discussion, conclusion, and references. Moving on to the introduction, lipids such as glycerophospholipids, glycerolipids, sphingolipids, phenols, sterols, saccharides, and polyketides are found to be abundantly present in the brain. These lipids play critical roles in maintaining the brain structural and functional components, as well as to maintain physiological functions of the neurons. Phospholipids are a class of lipids that maintains brain structure and functional components, and several neurodegenerative disorders such as dementia, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease have been associated with an imbalance in phospholipid metabolism, signaling, and transport. Phospholipids are a major component of biological membranes and are present in all types of food, rich in soya bean, egg yolk, and dairy products. Phospholipid profile in the brain continuously changes as the age advances. As our Indian diet mostly contains of milk products or dairy products, so we assume that they might have contributed to cognitive dysfunction. So performing phospholipids analysis of the serum samples from type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction and is comparing as comparison to type 2 diabetes patients without CD can provide us an insight into the role of these molecules in management of such patients. And it may also help in identifying a novel marker for future management of cognitive dysfunction in type 2 diabetes patients. The methodology which I used for my study was the cognitive dysfunction in the patients were based on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test, and I used one digit symbol substitution test to assess the mental speed. Now, moving on to the lipidomics analysis, LipidSearch software versus 4.2 was used to identify and quantify lipids from 18 major lipid classes in the database based on accurate precursor mass and characteristic fragments. Lipid identification was based on a tandem mass spectrometry match, that is an MS-MS match. So the mass tolerance for the precursor and fragment was 5 ppm and 5 ppm respectively, and a retention shift of 0.15 minutes was allowed for quantitation and alignment. The criteria to eliminate the false positives were lipid species dependent, And in addition to it, since ammonium acetate was used in the mobile phase, the adducts of H plus and NH4 plus were used in the positive mode search and negative H plus ion and acetate in the negative mode. For untargeted lipidomics, all the values were log 2 transformed to achieve normalization. Full change in the values were calculated for these lipids. So moving on to the methodology, the serum samples of the diabetic patients were collected from the biochemistry lab, KMC Manipal, after they had given the blood for the routine checkup. The serum samples were then the samples were then centrifuged and the serum were then stored at -80°C freezer for future analysis of lipidomics. The serum samples were thereafter transported to CCAMP and CBS mass spectrometry facility, Bangalore, in a box of dry ice maintaining a temperature of -80°C. 10 microliter of the serum samples were utilized for targeted lipidomics, and it was done by LCMS approach. So moving on to the preparation of samples, 10 microliter sample was collected in 1.5 ml capacity Eppendorf tube, which was in a low retention mode, and was taken, and 10 microliter of the splash standard was spiked in it. Equal volume of methanol, chloroform, and 0.89% potassium chloride were added for the sample preparation. Vortex was done for 1 minute, and incubation was done at 37°C for 10 minutes. Centrifugation was done at 10,000 RPM at 4°C for 5 minutes. Lower organic phase was separated into clean test tube. Equal volume of chloroform and 0.89% potassium chloride were added thereafter to the original Eppendorf tube containing the upper layer. The steps 3 and 4, as you can see here, so the vortexing and the centrifugation were repeated again. And the lower organic phase into the same 1.5 ml test tube was collected. The solvents were evaporated to dryness in gentle nitrogen steam or under vacuum. The residue was reconstituted in 200 microliter of methanol. From this, 5 microliter was injected into the LC analytical column with a flow rate of 300 microliter per minute and injection volume of 5 microliter. The buffers used for this study were acetonitrile and water with ammonium formate and with 0.1% formic acid. Isopropanol and acetonitrile with ammonium formate and with 1.1% formic acid was used as buffer B. These buffer A and buffer B are nothing but the mobile phases used for the preparation of the solvent. The mass spectrometry used here is of 140,000 resolution with positive and negative modes, and the mass spectrometry mass by charge ratio, that is the scan range, was taken between 200 to 1200 with a maximum injection time of 50. Moving on to the results of my analysis, this is the demographic parameters which describes the age, BMI, glycated hemoglobin, total cholesterol, triglyceride, LDL cholesterol were increased in patients with cognitive duration of diabetes. Vitamin B12 and TSH, these parameters were increased in type 2 diabetes patients with CD, whereas the HDL cholesterol, DSST scores, and education were found to be decreased in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. Now results. In our analysis, we found about 251 classes of phospholipids, which included 174 classes of phospholipid phosphatidylcholine, 9 classes of phosphatidylserine, 48 classes of phosphatidylethanolamine, 14 classes of phosphatidylinositol, and 6 classes of lysophosphatidylethanolamine. The results of our study, among these lipids, among these 251 lipids, only these lipid classes were found to be significant. PC 18:2, 20:4 had significantly changed in the cognitive dysfunction patients. Here I have not put about the I haven't put about that concentration of the samples, but since we have done log2 normalization, I have just showed the fold change in the cognitive dysfunction patients. So, 5 classes of phosphatidylcholine, 1 classes of lysophosphatidylethanolamin, and 1 class of phosphatidylinositol were found to be significantly different in type 2 diabetes patients with cognitive dysfunction. Moving on to the results, these are the whisker plots showing the median concentration of the phospholipid species in type 2 diabetes patients.
Sorry to interrupt. Your time is up.
Okay.
You can hurry.
I will just
Conclude it.
yeah. So these are this is the graphical analysis they're presenting the concentration of phospholipid in type 2 diabetes patients. Basically here in CD, we found that the PC was found to be low in type 2 diabetes patients with CD, and PC 18:1 D7 was also found to be low in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. Everything was significantly different. Here also, we can see the same thing, that in PC 18:2 was significantly less in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. And similarly, the same thing with 34:3D. Only in type 2 diabetes patients with CD, PC 38:1 was seen to be elevated, and phosphatidylinositol 18:0, 22:6 was also found to be elevated in cognitive dysfunction patients. So this is the concentration of LP, which was also found to be low in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. And these parameters all were significantly different in all the cognitive dysfunction patients. This is the heat map analysis showing significant changes in lipid species, as it is a broad study. And in this analysis, I got 646 classes of lipids. But here I have only showed about this phospholipids. As you can see that the red lines, deep red lines are the changes in the phospholipid concentration in this entire heat map analysis. So it determines the relative fold change species among all these lipid species in the specific samples which we have taken. So I will move on to the discussion. In our studies, 4 species were found to be lower in type 2 diabetes patients with CD when compared to NC group, and 1 species of phosphatidylinositol was found to be higher in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. So our study when compared to the normal group. In one study, like Kim et al. 2018 showed a large decrease in phosphatidylglycerol levels in the HDL fraction of cognitive dysfunction patients, and a significantly increased 2-fold levels were found for phosphatidyl inositol, phosphatidylethanol, and phosphatidylglycerol, which were contrary to our study findings. Another study also showed that higher levels of PE and PC were associated with greater odds of cognitive decline in cognitive dysfunction patients, which were contrary to our study findings. The reduced levels of phospholipid concentration were also found in one study in the white and gray matters of the hippocampus region in the brain, which were similar to our study findings. Early studies showed that phosphatidylserine intake could have a compensatory effect on cognitive deficits in elderly and Alzheimer's disease patients. However, in our study, we did not get any significance in phosphatidylserine significance levels, which may be due to the difference in dietary intake or the diabetic supplementation which the diabetic patients are taking, as they are already under controlled diet. In one study, phosphatidylethanolamin levels were found to be decreased in gray matter of cognitive dysfunction patients. So also we found lysophosphatidylethanolamin levels were unaltered in gray and white matter of CD patients. But our study didn't show alterations in phosphatidylethanol levels and showed significant decrease in lysophosphatidylethanol levels in type 2 diabetes patients with CD. Because this might be the reason because phospholipase C is derived from the phospholipids and it affects the dietary control of the patient. So when the phospholipase C interacts with the phospholipids, there might be few decrease in the lipid species concentration. So few studies evaluated the impact of phospholipid-enriched diets on cognitive process in adulthood, and their potential therapeutic benefits remain to be fully explored. So moving on to the conclusion that since discussion, the last thing, that type 2 diabetes patients are already advised to control diet, which has less carbohydrates and lipid content, which can be the main reason for affecting the phosphatidylcholine levels. So, as phosphatidylcholine could be also be synthesized endogenously, very few studies evaluated the impact of phospholipid-enriched diets. So further studies are required to emphasize that the possibility of deficiency of phospholipids and their potential therapeutic benefits also remain to be fully explored. So moving on to the conclusion, 4 species of phosphatidylcholine, lysophosphatidylethanolamin, and 1 species of phosphatidylinositol are promising subspecies of phospholipids, which can increase the reliability of clinical diagnosis of CD in type 2 diabetes patients. Large-scale confirmation is required for these findings, and the various classes of phospholipids need to be explored further. Also, nutritional intervention studies in each of the patients are required for future management of cognitive dysfunction in diabetes patients. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arpita, for an exhaustive presentation. Any questions on the floor? The sample was selected from the patients attending the cognitive clinic or from the
Yeah. Yes.
And what were the cognitive deficits they had?
The cognitive, it was just based on that visual spatial skills, learning and working memory, ma'am, like which we can identify from that MOCA test and from DSST, that is symbol substitution speed, that mental speed deficits were also taken.
Okay.
Based on the
and
scores.
Whether sugar level patients
no, it was not controlled. Like few patients, like I have seen, like before coming to the hospital, they stopped medicine, but like they were on each of the patients had more than 10 years of duration of diabetes. Okay, and and we did not take any other confounding factors like hypertension, hypothyroidism, which might affect our reliability of the study.
Okay, fine.
So they were diabetic for more than 10 years.
More than 10 years.
Yeah.
And HbA1c was not within limit?
No, HbA1c was uncontrolled.
Uncontrolled.
Yeah.
Okay. Then, if there are no questions, thank you,
Thank
Doctor.
you so much.
Next, I call upon Dr. Mala Selvarani to present her paper. Please try to stick on to the time.
Yes, good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Mala Selvarani, second year resident, MD Psychiatry, TVMCH, Tirunelveli Medical College. My case report is a case of cortical venous thrombosis masquerading as complicated alcohol withdrawal. Introduction, cerebral venous thrombosis is a rare form of thromboembolism with an incidence of 3 to 4 per million. It has diversity of causes and a highly variable clinical presentation. Case description, a 42-year-old male presented with complaints of headache, vomiting, and episodes of recurrent seizures. These symptoms were after the consumption of 360 ml of 40% alcohol continuously for 10 days, with the last intake being 12 hours before the onset of symptoms. There is history of alcohol and tobacco consumption in dependence pattern, and the patient is a known case of hypertension on atenolol 50 mg. On general examination, vitals normal. CNS examination, no significant focal neurological deficit. Fund is normal. Bilateral withdrawal tremors present. Mental status examination, talk relevant, coherent, thought perception, no abnormality detected, no craving for alcohol, mood anxious. Differential diagnosis, seizure disorder, alcohol dependence syndrome with complicated withdrawal. Investigations, blood and biochemical investigations were within normal limits, ECG normal, CT imaging, hyperdense superior sagittal sinus and cortical veins, MRI brain, dural venous sinus thrombosis involving sagittal sinus, bilateral transverse sinuses, and bilateral frontoparietal cortical venous thrombosis. Final diagnosis and management, cortical venous thrombosis and with alcohol dependence syndrome. Neurologist opinion obtained, patient started on anticoagulants and antiepileptics, detoxification done, injection thiamine supplementation given, engaged in motivation enhancement therapy. Discussion and conclusion, clinical manifestations of cortical venous sinus thrombosis are non-specific and it is a diagnostic challenge. Symptoms such as headache, nausea, vomiting, seizures are common in alcohol withdrawal and cortical venous thrombosis. Strong suspicion and careful observations should remain in any patient with persistent neurologic features. Early initiation of treatment with anticoagulants will enable complete recovery without complications. And these are my references. Thank you.
Thank you. You were too fast. Thank you. Can I have that slide? Okay. And you were rightly pointed out that we have to rule out all the organic causes before we jump into a conclusion of alcohol withdrawal. Okay. Any questions from the floor? Okay. I have no questions. Thank you. Next, I call upon Dr. Veerasamy to present a study on socio-demographic profile and psychiatric morbidity among transgenders.
Good morning to all. My study is socio-demographic profile and psychiatric morbidity among transgenders, a cross-sectional study. Introduction. Transgender people refers to a person whose identity and gender is different from their birth assigned sex. Previous studies suggested that there is an association between depression and substance use, high-risk sexual behavior, and suicide among transgender. The risk of anxiety disorders is 3 times more in transgender than the general population. This study was done to explore the psychiatric morbidity among transgenders. Aim and objectives to assess depression, anxiety, and stress among transgender people, to correlate socio-demographic profile with depression and anxiety. Methodology. The study was done at transgender community situated near Chengalpattu. Informed consent was obtained. 35 transgender persons who gave consent were included in the study. Comprehensive interview and mental status examination was performed. Information about socio-demographic and clinical profile was collected. Depression anxiety stress scale, that is DASS 21, was used to assess the depression, anxiety, and stress among them. Statistical analysis was done using SPSS version 20.0. Institutional ethical committee approval obtained. Results. Out of 35 transgender people, 48.6% belong to the age group of 18 to 30. 94.3% of them gender at birth is male. 51.4% are from rural area. 60% of them from a middle socioeconomic status, and 62.9% of them had secondary school education. 69.5% of them have the begging as a primary source of income. 74.3% of them staying in rented house. About 71.4% of them staying with transgender colleagues, and 60% of them recognized as transgender within 20 years of age. 80% of them left their house within 20 years of age. 51.4% of them involved in sex work. And 62.9% of them are done gender reassignment surgery. Among them, 34% of them done legally, and rest of them done illegally. Then 28.6% of them had physical comorbidity, and 14.4% of them getting treatment from the private hospitals, and 57.1% of them registered in their association, and 34 0.3% had the history of suicidal attempts, and 62.9% of them had the history of substance use. 52.3% of them expecting housing, employment, and health facilities from the government. And, a score of greater than or equal to 10 for depression, 8 for anxiety, and 15 for stress was taken as cutoff using DASS 21 scale. The result of our study have various psychiatric morbidity in the form of depression, anxiety symptoms, and stress of about 31.4%, 22.9%, and 34.3% respectively. Then demographic details and psychiatric morbidity. In that, there was a relationship between transgender who involved in sex work and stress. It was statistically significant with p-value of 0.04, that is less than 0.05. There was no relationship between depression, anxiety symptoms, and stress with other domains of socio-demographic profile. Discussion. According to findings in the study done by Niranjan Habbar OR et al. 2016 in transgender people from Manipur, depression was seen in 46.87%. Generalized anxiety disorder was seen in 37.5%. This finding is similar to our study with the similar rates of depression, but we had used a screening tool, whereas they had used a diagnostic tool. According to findings in the study done by Farnam et al. 2019 in Iranian transgender woman has reported depression, anxiety symptoms, and stress of about 22%, 20.4%, and 17.3% respectively, which is lower than that of our study. Higher levels of depression and anxiety symptoms in our study may be because we consider all severity from mild to extremely severe, but in their study they are considered only severe and extremely severe cases only. Then, according to findings in the study done by Ruji Chang et al. 2019 in Chinese transgender woman who was in sex work has reported 25.25% of them had severe depression. Our study has a similar finding of association between sex work and stress, suggestive that they were involved in sex work as they do not have other means of earning and or employment. Our study population lived as a group in a community, and this could be a contributing factor for lower level of depression and anxiety compared to other similar studies. Conclusion: this study concludes that the various psychiatric morbidity was found in transgender, and this has to be taken into account. Proper attention should be given for their socio-economic requirements that would improve their quality of life. These are my references. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. That's a really thought-provoking study for the future because we have to start understanding and accepting them. Okay. And did you find any difference for the transgenders who were male by birth and converted to female? Any difference in that, in the psychiatric morbidity among?
No, ma'am.
No, it was equally.
It's equally
for both the sexes.
Yeah,
the conversion to both sexes,
yes,
it was the same.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, in 35 of them, only two of them only converted from female to male. Other all are converted from male to female.
Okay,
yes.
That was more common.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any questions, Dr. Arpita? Any question? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Next, I call upon Dr. Geeta Rajashekar for the most ongoing process about the patient satisfaction on virtual consultation in psychiatric disorders.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Here I am here to present you the data from our hospital. What we did was for the past 1 year, and what we found out from the patient level regarding virtual consultations. So since we have running short of time, I will try to summarize the presentations as far as possible. We started our virtual consultations around the year 2020 when the COVID epidemic started and the guidelines were issued regarding virtual consultations. And by 29th, when the guidelines started coming by 25th March, we started around 29th March, the first consultation. And it was the time when the lockdown was started in India, and most people were finding it difficult to come over to the hospital and get the medicines and consult with the doctor. So why we did the study was, we had some questions lingered in our mind. That is, are they happy with the virtual consultation? Is there sufficient privacy at home environment to answer the doctor's question and do the consultation? How satisfied they are, and do they feel the logistics of virtual consultation easy? Is virtual consultation pocket friendly? So these questions we had in our mind. So we tried to find out the reasons for that. And from March 2020 to September 2021, we had completed 3,419 virtual consultations and 2,119 patients of. And among them, 242 were new consultation who first consulted a psychiatrist online. It was the first consultation. We did the consultation and asked them to come for the face-to-face review to the hospital by direct visit once the lockdown is over. And 1,877 were review consultations. And these are the month-wise consultations data. You will be able to see that during the phases of lockdown months and COVID months, in Trichy, we had the first wave of COVID happening only in June to July, August. We have the most number of consultations at that time. In 2021, obviously during the second wave, May and June, we had the most number of consultations. Average, we are getting 180 consultations per month on virtual side. And age groups which we have treated are, the maximum age group is 31 to 40 years of age who get the virtual consultations the most. And gender, we have equal distribution of virtual consultations. And patients prefer timings, you will be able to see 15 to 16 hours. That is 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. is the maximum time which patients prefer to get consulted. They give their preference time in the online appointment form, their preferred consultation. And you can see some patients asking for 12 o'clock, midnight to 1 o'clock in that midnight zone also. We have 24 hours appointment system and they prefer those times as well. And obviously we have one of our senior consultant doing that time consultations because he finds that time suitable for meeting patients. And people come for that consultation also at 12 o'clock midnight. And patients' preference during first consultation is, when they come to a psychiatric consultation virtually, there is a lot of stigma associated with visiting the psychiatric hospital. So they prefer first consultation virtually, most of them, this 242 people. And when they give their appointment booking, when they book their appointment, they don't know whom to consult first. So most of them leave the question unanswered. Certain people tell, I want to visit the psychiatrist. Certain people prefer counselor. And preferred number of appointment days from booking time is, most of the patients ask for the same date consultation, and the next day is preferred by around 24%. And from this whole data, we wanted to assess the patient satisfaction. So by a cross-sectional study. So we took, in order to avoid the recall bias while asking questions, because they would have considered a long back and we can't ask them how satisfied you are now. So we took August and September, the more recent consultation months, and we took the patients were 262 in number. And since we didn't have a previous literature on virtual consultation in psychiatry and patient satisfaction levels, which suits our setup, so we calculated a relative precision of taking into consideration 50% satisfaction levels, and we arrived at a sample size of 100. So we sent a patient satisfaction questionnaire through Google form, and we had 8 questions in Likert scales type, whether you are very satisfied or whether you are least satisfied. And the privacy, the amount spent, and the satisfaction related questions and suggestions to improve, all those questions were there in the questionnaire. And informed consents were taken. 119 response came back from the 262 request what we sent. And among the 119, 4 declined to participate, and we had the sample of 115. So among the people, again, 31 to 40 years of age group people only can do the virtual consultations the most. The next one, 5160, take the help of their son or daughter and their relatives who are computer savvy, and they do the consultations. And gender is the same, similar, like 49, 50, 66. There is a slight females using the consultations more, virtual consultation more than males. And then when you see the time between the call to schedule an appointment and your appointment date, 50% are very satisfied with the thing. And the manners of the which person who schedules their appointment is 66%. They are, very satisfied is 66%. And your waiting time after logging in for consultation. This happens when our consultants are doing the I mean, face-to-face routine consultation in the clinics or in their cabins. Virtual consultations also comes in. The appointments will be there, but the doctors has to find time between to do this and that. So sometimes this patient will be taking too long, and that virtual consultation patient will be waiting for a while. So we are trying to address these issues, and we found that 44% only got satisfied with that waiting time after logging in. So your physician and care providers listening skills, very satisfied are 82%. And her explanation of diagnosis and treatment, very satisfied is 78%. And her personal manners, courtesy, respect, sensitivity, and friendliness, very satisfied is 84%. Her technical skills of the physician or practitioner, thoroughness, carefulness, competence, very satisfied is 80%. And how prepared the staff and physicians are in taking out the records, the previous case records, and providing educational materials, all those things. That one very satisfied is 66%. So this questionnaire, when all the questions are least answered by or not satisfied, if all the patients are least satisfied, they will be answering 1 as least satisfied, and the minimum score will be 8. Maximum score very satisfied will be 5. So the maximum score will be 40. So we got the score as 36.32, and the standard deviation was 4.40. And online appointments, we also wanted to know who made the online appointments for the patients, because it requires a little bit of tech savviness. We have to log into the website, fill up the Google form regarding their details, and then they have to make an online payment, and then they have to do a virtual consultation. So this requires a lot of tech savviness, which is not present in all of the patients which we treat. But still, patient comes to us for visual consultation. So we wanted to know who does it. So we found that 65%, 65 people, patients relative 65 people do that, but whereas patients 50 people do that. The p-value is not significant, but I'm sure that over a period of years, if we have so much of data available and we take a larger sample, this will come out to be quietly significant. And would you return to see the physician in virtual consultation mode? Yes. And would you recommend this virtual consultation practice to friends and families? Yes. And was there any breakage of video and voice during consultation? This happens quite frequently, because you could see nearly 14% people had some problem with their internet connection and other things during virtual consultation mode, which can hamper the quality of consultation what we do. So this we have to have put our attention to it and solve this issue in future. And then, was your home environment a hurdle to express yourself during consultation? Most of them have said no. 86% have said no. And then but whereas 13% or nearly 14% have said yes. So that also we have to consider. So it's better to ask at the end of the consultation, were you able to communicate well with us freely at the end of each consultation, so that we can come to know, and we can at least suggest them to come for a direct consultation once they feel there is a certain hurdle in the home environment to express themselves. Because interpersonal issues, family problems, along with the husband in a virtual consultation mode, where at least in direct consultation, we can ask the husband to wait for some time outside. But in virtual consultation mode, it's very difficult. Compared to the direct consultation with your physician, the amount you spend on virtual consultations, 77 people have said we have spent less in virtual consultation compared to the direct consultation, whereas 38 people have said more. The 77 people have said that it is near equal or less. So they have mentioned the amount also in the next question, like the range is between 1,500 to 5,000 rupees. Most of the long distance people find it very easy and very pocket friendly, the virtual consultations. And in summary, what we found is like the score of patient satisfaction is 90%. Amount spent is equal or less than the direct consultations. Privacy for consultation at home environment is not a hurdle. There is no difference between the number of consultations among both genders. But although the females express more satisfaction with the virtual consultations, patients prefer consultation on the same date of booking, which all the institutions which does this services have to be sensitive about that, and we have to have some ways to do that. And the age group between 31 to 40 use teleconsultations the most, and some degree of tech savviness is needed. because mostly 50% have booked the appointments only with the help of their relatives who is tech savvy. So we have to have this virtual consultation booking and appointment system more simplified, so that more rural people, more people who are out of reach can utilize it. And with this, thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. May I know what virtual mode was used, ma'am?
Ma'am, we use a Google Meet mode, ma'am. We have to, the patient has to book from the website, Atma Hospital website.
And they have to have that application also, Google Meet.
No, they actually, if they don't have the Google Meet app, we can do the WhatsApp consultation also,
Okay.
whichever is their preference. But the appointment has to be made by Google Meet.
Google
If
Meet.
they find that too difficult, the helpline number is there. We do the only audio consultations for those people without the face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, many say they don't have that smartphones.
Smartphones, yeah.
And educational status, depending on that, did they find it
Yeah.
difficult or not?
Yeah,
That
they
is
find
there.
it difficult because we in this 120 patients, sorry, 115 patients, the educational status and the addresses, especially in the rural areas, they find it difficult
Very
to.
difficult. Did you do proxy consultations also?
No,
ma'am?
no, no.
No,
Only
you
in this we do the direct consultation. Virtual
Okay.
consultation at home, it's only for the patient.
Okay.
Mm.
And non-cooperative patients? They were-
Non-cooperative patients, if we meet them in virtual consultation, we ask the relative to do an emergency, the immediate prescription what they have to give, and ask them to come back to the hospital. If they are violent, just bring them. Like that, we advise.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for such a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Next, I call upon Dr. Kavita Parthiban. She's not here.
She'll not make it on time. Actually, no one question. ನಮ್ಮ best presenter award.
Okay. There's an award for the best presentation today. Based on finishing it on time, and the content and the thing for the future, Dr. Veerasamy is getting the best paper award. Thank you all. We wind up this session.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Rajaram to honor our chairperson, Ms. Sophia. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. We are so privileged to have you over here. The next session will commence at 9:30.